Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Azure for sure. And as always, I'm your host, Stephen Simon. I never say my first name. I don't know why I did that. I always say I'm your host, Simon. And welcome back. I'm really excited. This is the episode number 5, which means we're only halfway down to the season 2. If you're someone who's joining us for the very first time, this is season 2 of Azure for sure. And we do it in the first and the second quarter of every year. Well, this is our second year. And every season has 2 episodes, and we stream it strictly on Thursdays at 10 a.m. Pacific. At this instance, if you're joining from India, it is 11:30 p.m. And by the show ends, it will be a new day for us. Isn't that pretty cool? If you're joining from India, let us know. You are very dedicated, I can bet. So yeah, today's episode is really exciting because I'm gonna host Richard Toland. I hope I say that right. He's a principal architect, developer, and owner of Perpetual Reality. But even before that, I just recall I hosted Richard 2 years back, almost 2 years back, March 2020. The conference name was Power Platform Virtual Conference, and here this is what I could pull out the promotion that we had. There we have our guest Richard, and he delivered a session along with Stacy, if I'm not wrong. And his session was, and I have the title over here, right? I pulled up my Excel sheet. He then talked about 2010 workflows to M365 Power Platform. So I always love my guests and speakers who take out their time and come on to these live shows and virtual conferences, right? They're not getting paid, right? Anything. They're not making any money out of it. But so just really want to thank Richard. And yeah, without any further ado, let's bring our guest, Richard. Hi, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
I'm doing absolutely great. Thank you so much, Richard, for accepting the invitation. Right, I know it's a work day, Thursday. By the way, where are you joining us today from?
I'm in Denver, Colorado, or just outside of Denver, Colorado, in
Oh,
the
Denver.
U.S.
Okay. Yeah, in the US. So thank you, Richard. So you have a very interesting session, right? You say everyone works on Power Web Apps on Azure, right? I think this was one of the earliest offerings. If you talk, if it more VMs and SQL servers, right? But you say Power of Web Apps and Azure, right? So it's really interesting to see what you're going to talk about. So yeah, I won't take much of your time. I'll brief everyone whoever's watching it. Please feel free to go ahead and ask your question in the comments while Richard delivers it, and we'll take it towards the end, or even if Richard sees in between. So, Richard, I'm gonna put your screen. Everybody else can see your screen now,
Cool.
and next 25-30 minutes is all yours.
Very cool. Yeah, so what I'm going to cover today is it builds a little bit on some of that Power Platform conversation that we had a year, 2 years ago, where we're looking for Azure integration, right? Instead of Power Platform integration and calling off to premium connectors in the Power Platform and Power Automate specifically for triggering flows. One of the things that we're going to do is examine some automation through integration with web platforms, and largely that happens through something called a webhook or through a REST call. And you hook into the Azure functions or Azure logic apps or Azure runbooks that you want to use to do automation things, right? The definition of a runbook is usually structured in a scripted fashion where you can really get down in the weeds with something like a PowerShell language and drive into the different configuration elements that you'd be looking to do across your Azure landscape. Maybe you want to build and deploy Azure VMs. Maybe you want to trigger code deployment pipelines from Azure DevOps. Maybe you want to manipulate security groups. This is an example that we'll walk through where we'll look at where we're creating an Azure AD group and adding Azure AD users to that group. So a couple of different examples here in Runbooks we'll run through. We're also going to look at some logic apps. We're going to go through and I'll walk you through a logic app we set up for an integrated scenario here that is the kind of the primary. I'd say this is the meat and potatoes of our talk today, where we're looking to integrate to these automation hooks and how we can achieve that. Like you heard me mention, we can go through REST endpoints. We can call directly to negotiated RESTful payloads, and I can make authenticated or unauthenticated calls to an HTTP trigger. Alternatively, if I set up in a Runbook scenario, whoops, that's not there's the Runbook. You can add webhooks. So webhooks are a similar kind of construct where you call a web endpoint and you can feed it parameters that you have if you needed to pass parameters through. And the way that we do that, you can see here, this URL is very similar in its construct, right? So this webhook URL looks fairly similar to what I'm doing in my Logic app as well. And from the Azure side, or excuse me, from the Logic app side, when I call, oops, sorry, that's a run from it. The configuration here, this URL is very similar in its structure. It's on the front side a little bit different, but you'll see a lot of the same elements, right? It says, hey, what's my tenant ID? Let me do this. We're going to go to Notepad. Excellent. I'm going to paste this in here just so we can look at it. So I've got a tenant ID in here that I'm telling the Logic app what tenant I'm running across. This is the security key for this specific, I want to call it a security key configuration. It's not really security, but this one says the token for the specific action that I'm trying to achieve, right? Or the trigger point for the HTTP. When HTTP request is received, Logic app trigger. Similar on the webhook side, for a Runbook, you'll see I have another token here in the URL structure for the Runbook side. And again, it's referencing what's my tenant, where am I going? I'm looking at webhooks for some Azure Automation stuff. Now, let's kind of back up a little higher and let's look at the logical structure of things that you can deploy throughout your Azure automation landscape, right? So things that you can deploy. I'm going to go back to home here, and I'm going to do a search. Well, maybe we'll do an ad, right? I want to create a resource, and let's do a little browse through some catalogs here. So you've heard me mention runbooks. Runbooks run in something called automation. And when you create an automation account, let this thing filter it down. You'll create an Azure Automation setup. Inside of here, you can create an Azure Automation account, and we'll look through each of these automation pieces. What you're allowed to do inside of the automation construct is you can do schedules, triggers. You can set up webhooks to run scripts. Maybe you've got Python, or you want to go after some PowerShell and run those scripts in runbooks inside. You can set up key vault authentication, manage identities, all kinds of things. So that's in your automation space. And largely I would say the bulk of the automation is driven towards scripted automation. It's a Python or PowerShell automation structure, or all the things that you would build as a scaffolding to feed a PowerShell. Maybe you need modules for Python or PowerShell to support the commandlets that you want to leverage. Maybe you need authentication for usernames, passwords, managed identities, or application certificate and token exchanges. Those things are all tracked in here in an automation resource group and resource. And then let's open one of those so we can have a look and see what's inside of one of those. I'm going to go to this whirligig automation, and let's drill down the left-hand side. You'll see, I'm going to push it over here. As we're going through, just so we're kind of centered up on the screen, I've got my overview. This tells me what's going on, what subscription it belongs to, what tenant I'm in, et cetera, et cetera. If I look down the left-hand side, you'll see there's a section called Runbooks where we've got the definition of what are our scripts. All of them, when you provision them, you'll get these tutorials. You can go through, learn how to do Python or PowerShell, or each of those tutorials is great because it runs through the different types of PowerShell. You can do PowerShell script, you can do graphical PowerShell, and you can do PowerShell workflows. So parent-child kind of structure. And then you could effectively, to start them, you would start a Runbook with a job. If I open one of these to take a look, you'd start it with here and feed it any parameters that you may need to feed your script, and off you go. Or the webhook can start those. When they're started, they'll show up back in the jobs. So as they start or queue, the runbooks would run. They'll start up and fire off jobs. Those jobs can be scheduled. So you can set up schedules to run certain times a day. If I wanted to set this up to run like a 1 a.m., 2 a.m., etc. We're not going to do that today, since we're primarily looking at how do I integrate a call into the webhooks, right? Or the HTTP trigger points. You could also, the section I mentioned for modules, you have Python packages or modules for PowerShell, any credentials that you may be after you need to use to authenticate with your automation there. And then if you've got predefined connections or certificates, those are there to support you as well. So this is great. This is one of the automation methods throughout that you can leverage throughout Azure. It's got the reach of anything that you can authenticate to, right? So when we talk about the notion of security principle, that could be a user, that can be an application that's registered as an enterprise application, or it could be a managed identity. Each of the managed identities, if I come to the identity section, one thing we're going to look at here is a user assigned managed identity in a minute. But several of the automation resources themselves and data storage, Azure SQL, Azure Cosmos DB, the Azure Data Factory, they can all set up their own system assigned managed identity, which is kind of a global thing. And you can grant permissions or roles throughout Azure as maybe you want to talk to Graph API, or you want to talk to SharePoint API, you want it to be able to manage users or groups. When you turn on this system assigned managed identity, that says basically everything in Whirligig Automation can do what it needs to do with the global permissions, I would say, which is a little dangerous and not fully recommended there. Yes, managed identities are recommended, but maybe not for the whole service, because if you set up this whole resource and you're doing multiple runbooks it grants a little too much permissions. And if we've learned anything over decades of IT, right, it's hardening layers. You want to separate duties whenever possible. So the better way to do that with a managed identity is to do that with a user assigned managed identity. And the notion of a user assigned managed identity is that you can assign each one to have specific roles. So maybe one can talk to SharePoint, one can talk to Azure, one can would have user manipulation, one would have Teams provisioning, maybe one would have storage provisioning or VMs provisioning. Maybe one would have group management to create groups or remove groups from Azure AD. So each of those managed identities are then user assigned by an admin to be purpose built and leveraged then inside of your automations for those specific purposes. So I would have one runbook that could talk to a user group, one runbook that could talk to VMs, and they would all use their own managed identities. So that's Azure Automation in a nutshell. We'll come back to that near the end when we go back to a specific runbook and look through the details there. Another one that we can provision is Azure Functions. Those are very popular coded options. If you're a developer, you can do Azure Functions as I typed in the whole thing there. I picked the wrong one. An Azure function allows for PowerShell or C#. Pick your language, not C#, but you can kind of pick your language, pick your flavor or poison of whichever type of Azure function you want to build. Generally, Azure functions are built by developers and come in different plans. So a consumption-based, and we'll look at this with logic apps as well. Azure functions and logic apps can be hot, online, ready to go, waiting for calls. You can have them a little less performant for a little less cost in a consumption-based model. So the difference is standard versus consumption-based. And the consumption-based is, I would say, as you're getting started in here, it's a great starting point. It only bills you for the time or memory allocation that's assigned to any of the automation pieces that you're exploring. But then, when you want to go full production, you may want to evaluate, do I have enough throughput on whatever automation piece I'm doing, how frequently I'm calling this from my website integrations, or putting on a schedule to run every 30 seconds. If it's performant enough, then you'd want to start looking at what kind of plan options you have, both functions, Azure functions, function apps, or logic apps. all kind of work in that same kind of container and plan option. So look into that as you're building out. So the last one you heard me mention is Logic App. So these are kind of the three that we're going to target today. Logic Apps are great. They are the sister product to Power Platform's Power Automate Flow, right? So each Logic App that you build here can replace or augment a Power Automate Flow. They have a lot of the same. It's the same kind of landscape. You build your Logic App here. Again, you choose your plan, whichever plan you want to go with for your provisioning and your billing impacts. And let's take a look here. We'll just drive in. In the Logic App itself, as you pick your consumption-based versus standard-based, the standard is the little bit more performant. It's ready to go on production, and you're a little bit more responsive. They don't usually, depending on what you're putting in your Logic App, it doesn't run any faster, I would say, but its response time is a little bit. The turnaround for I'm listening and I'm answering is a little bit faster on that. So if you have really high throughput, it makes a big impact. If you're only calling it once every couple of seconds, generally consumption's okay. There is a cost impact to both of those, right? So take a look at that. As with anything that you're looking at in Azure, definitely measure it out, see how it goes, maybe in the consumption. You can't change it once it's been carved out that way. You can't change your plan type, but you can take the code behind it and make a brand new one and paste in your code. So you can just spit it right in there. Way to do that, if we look at a Logic App, I'm going to go, let me just pop into one of these. So inside of a Logic App, if I put it in edit mode, you can see your code view here. And basically it's a JSON definition similar to the ARM template that you take the majority of this and you can copy and paste it out. If you're jumping between tenants, I will mention, because we do this quite often. If you're jumping between tenants, you'll want to set up all your connections that you use throughout your Logic App. And that may be a service connection to Azure Data Factory, to Azure Runbooks running in Azure Automation. You may have a connection to, this one is a SharePoint Online example we're going to look at. So you want to define your connections, just make an action for each one of those connections, give it the credentials that you want to use, username and password, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then keep those connections, paste everything else. Connections are always at the last. It's one of the parameters. It's at the very last of your Logic App. But everything above this comma basically is copy paste into the next one. And you can jump between tenants to promote. Maybe you have a dev tenant or a staging tenant, and then you go to production during that promotion cycle. You can also set those up if you are doing ARM provisioning or automated pipeline deployments for your Azure resources. Azure Resource Manager templates can help you parameterize this too. So you can set up the right subscription. And the only reason that you don't copy paste this one is it's the subscription that matters. What subscription are you connected to for your Azure Runbooks and your Azure Automation? What subscription for SharePoint Online, Teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's pop back into the designer mode. We're going to take a look at how we've threaded this through, right? What's an example of how can I trigger these things from a website? We on the SharePoint side, I'm actually going to use a SharePoint site's custom column formatter to do the trigger and make the HTTP call to our actual web method here. The methods that were put in here, I did a blind get. You can actually change your post, change it to a post or a patch or delete, depending on what your needs are. We set this one up in the demo mode here it's a blind get, but I do a call as a get, but I feed it the parameters with the switches in the relative path. The switches are then parsed out, right? So each one of these method that I want to tackle, let me zoom this in a little bit. So if I wanted to go in, for this specific one, we wanted to, in the use case for the example, let me pop over to the SharePoint side. I'll show you what our use case is. We have an image library. And on this image library, these are specific products that Contoso has listed in their consumer retail site. If I want to take a look at this site, we can go back and look at from their site contents. They have a product list. The products are, listed off to do whatever they want to sell them off, right? So maybe there's a price point and an inventory that they care about. But the images here are what we're concerned with on the image library that these are pulling from. Maybe the image is sour, right? Or maybe I need a higher resolution, or maybe I have an updated version of the product that we want to get a new image on. And this example, the use case we're going to use is we have different teams in our organization at Contoso that would be achieving those functions, right? Our blue team, maybe they are the high-res image capture team. The red team could do color management, could do right hues, pixelation, do some touch-up post-production. Usually, in the color coding here, this demo we've run before as an end-on system for clients where we set up a column in a SharePoint list where they're tracking a process, some process, red, yellow, green light, and the process changes over time to do as a hands-off between red light to yellow light to green light to green light the product or process and feed on. Kind of the same kind of structure here, right? But what we're doing is we are changing teams whenever I click on one of these. And you can see, so in a little bit different, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a SharePoint column, but to show the difference here, by default, we'll set up another one. We'll set this up as a default list column, choice column, sorry. Awesome. And you'll notice by default, it shows me some color coding in here. I can change the color codes if I want to. Grab whatever I want it to be. That's great. As I go through, these are my default choices. Maybe I'll have it default to choice. No, I got to pick one. Sorry. Choice 2. Awesome. And I'm going to save that. Great. I got a new column. When I click on, you'll notice if I, okay, go away. Go. So if I hover over this column, nothing happens. Nothing special is happening there. If I grab an item, I want to go and change the details. We're going to manipulate the thing. That's great. I can see the behavior of the column as it came right off the shelf. This is the off-the-shelf color coding thing. If I hover over this, nothing happens, nothing changes. Now, the one that we've modified here, the responsible team, is on changing teams. I've made this a little bit different. We've used something called a column formatter. Let me show you how that happens. In your column formatting here, I'm going to go back to the list. Let me close this down. And on this column, I'm going to go jump into my column formatting. Now, this would be similar to any HTML editing you do. Column formatting for SharePoint Online works very similar to, well, it's all JSON construct. There's actually no hard code for the formatting option. However, you can embed a little bit of script magic, CSS magic inside of these, which is great. So what we get here off the default choice column is basically, if I come down to my little editor, maybe I can make this a little bigger too. Get rid of my header. Let's get a little bigger. I'm gonna drag this guy across here. Okay. So you see here, I'm grabbing some CSS. I get a choice option. This is the text that it's going to show. It's shown as a little pill. The pills are based on the color coding, and the pill shape are all based on the CSS that's embedded in here, Microsoft CSS. But you can roll your own, right, in your own HTML page, do whatever you want to do. What we don't have here, you'll notice these are all just pick and set the choice value across my list of stuff. But I needed to trigger an HTTP call, right? So the hard way that we did this is if I go and I look at this team, we manipulated it here. I did the same exact thing. Start with a choice column, grab the color coding, that's neat, and then we blow out the color coding to get a little bit more fancy and some wizardry. In that, we set up a hover method, and you'll see that, right? If I hover over the column of the items here, I get a little card that pops up, a little div. We built a div. This is an HTML div that's defined as elements in that JSON structure, and then we assign a behavior of an A tag, right, or one of the other div elements that's in the page. We put this little lock icon, so I can lock this down to the blue team or the red team or whatever I need it to be, and the A attribute for the href, the link attribute on that href actually feeds out. It calls out to the endpoint that you saw me looking at earlier, right? From Notepad, we were evaluating what tenant am I talking to, what's my code, for my token, And then what methods am I doing, right? I'm feeding it in the parameters on the HTTP call. And what do? We actually load this into an iframe. So it's an element type of an A tag. We wrap it up as an A tag, just like an href. And we call this basically this giant URL string, feeding it the parameters that I want to. Some fancy wizardry in here is that these column formatters can grab specific attributes or field values from the SharePoint list backend that's metadata that I'm feeding across. But you can really embed that in anything to pass a parameter from any link in any website. The idea is we're just passing parameterized values from a link. It's an A tag href link. We're sending a HTTP call and nesting it in a 1 pixel by 1 pixel invisible iframe somewhere in here on the page. So that's how it works. So as we're flowing this through, I'm going to go back to the lock and take a look at the lock here, and we'll see it run side by side. So let me zoom this back out. I'm going to go to my trigger runs. Whoops. Zoom page, zoom page, zoom page. There we go. Okay, so now I have my, where are you? Here's my list of trigger runs. Kind of tiny on the screen there, it looks like. But what I'm going to do is, let me go back to the SharePoint list, and I'm going to fire it off. So we'll hover over this green team. I'm going to change it off to the red team. Let's lock this bad boy down to the red team because I need some coloration, post-production color correction. All right, so I click that link on my SharePoint list. href link went off. It called the new trigger. If I come back over here and I refresh, you'll see that the 10:08 a.m. That's not us. Wait, did I click the right link? Red team. Call link. Now, the demo gods are not so nice to me today here. All right, well, I'm not entirely sure why it's not doing that. We'll go through and we'll take a look at one of these successful runs. As I dig into the way that it runs, so the trigger comes through, you'll see the parameters as they're built through. You can see the ins and outs, and magically all of a sudden my network has tanked. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this was what was fed through, right? So I get the actual inputs and outputs. I can see the inputs come through. Oops, nope, those are my parameterized ones. Let's go back into this guy. And as it comes through, the call builds out or grabs the methods, right? So I define what's this attribute, this method attribute is apply. I'm applying the red team assignment to what I want to do. I'm going to assign an Azure Active Directory group to secure this item down. So go off and find the ID for the Azure Active Directory group that I need inside of SharePoint. I'll do some manipulation, lock it down, right? Other things that you could do here is, hey, maybe I want to use a logic app to go fire off some VMs. Maybe I want to just call a Runbook and say start up some VMs, or provision me another ARM templated site or infrastructure. As we come down, I'm going to scroll down just a little bit and we'll dig a little faster into this. So I'm going to look on a switch. Basically, I'm looking for the method, right? My method was apply. I came through and you'll notice it selected, it was red team I was after. And when I picked the lock it to the red team, on the red team, it says, great, I want to show, I want to lock this down to the Azure AD group. Go fetch that Azure AD group and apply that to the SharePoint item to manage its permissions and lock it down. If I look at those custom permissions over here, I think I've already got it loaded. Nope, it reloaded. So we said two things, twofold for the red team. It says add a SharePoint group, right? For the red team people that live in that SharePoint site. Also, go out to Azure AD, fetch me the Azure AD group for the members because I want to lock this to those specific people, right? This could be create a team and go add these, make a new channel, go add these people to the channel, go crazy in your logic app. And all of those actions in here, like I said, this is the sister product of Flow. So almost all of the Flow actions and triggers that you have, I would say probably 80% are available to you. And any that you don't have, you can import the code. So again, in that show me the code, view the code section, you can grab a snippet from a flow on Power Automate and pull that through into your Logic App 2 and tweak it to fit in here too. So anyway, so we did that, right? So I called the red one. I said, make one of these red. It went out. It changed the, it set the value. That's the very last thing we do. So upon successful permissions management, it comes down here and it sets the value of the item to choice of red team. So this is great. I've got data manipulation. I've got security manipulation. If I wanted to go one step further in here, I can call off and say, hey, listen, also go add, go adjust Azure AD group called red team. So if I go back to the group management of the permission screen here, I can grab this Azure AD group because I've got its group ID. I'm gonna go manipulate this red team and maybe add specific users to it, or maybe invite a guest, and then maybe also email them off. So the Azure Automation trigger from the Logic app can reach directly into now your runbooks to do other additional advanced things that maybe you don't get from an action that's already published in the Logic app. So it's pretty powerful. I think I've run up against time, so I want to make sure we are okay. Simon, shall I keep going or should we call it? All right, I'll keep going. So let me scoot this over. I'm going to jump into an actual runbook here, and we'll take a look at one of these. So the runbook web method is a little different in that I'm not sure what it's doing there, but let me pick on this. Okay, so the if I pop in here, a runbook, PowerShell runbook is the example that we're using here. And on my PowerShell runbook, I've got lots of parameters that are set up here. So I can take that group name or its group ID, and I can go after that group ID. Actually, let's look at a different one. I'm going to go to adding a user to a group because we mentioned we could do that too. Right, so I would make, whether I did this with a webhook, a link from that I could click inside of my website or SharePoint site or any modern method that you want to grab an A tag. I could call this link to a webhook and pass these parameters to my runbook as well. Now, again, why do you jump to runbooks or Azure functions? It's really, the Logic apps are really powerful. There's a big bulk of actions that are available to you. And if I wanted to add an action, like if I'm modifying a Logic app, let me pop in here in edit mode, and I want to go add an action. I just grab this little plus icon, add an action, and there's a great big catalog of things that are in my tenant throughout Azure or throughout Microsoft 365 services available to you based on your licensure, or you can reach beyond into other peer services, right? So other cloud services that are out there, or if you have a Power BI data gateway, you want to reach on-prem, you can grab data from on-prem to do data manipulation or grab from on-prem sources too. So lots of options here. The cost benefit of the Logic app is the primary analysis, right? You really want to look at, because they're cheap. I mean, a Logic app can run and a runbook can run for hundredths of a penny, hundredths, 0.001. Lots of, you can get into really fast actions and they're really cheap. And conversely, some of the calls, the triggers, this HTTP trigger, the reach to call other web services, oftentimes those will incur a premium license on the Power Automate side. So when you're looking at Power Platform, maybe I don't want to pay $10 per user per month on a per user plan, or they've just rolled out consumption as well, consumption model or usage model for Power Automate flows. And it's great, but it's definitely more expensive. I think because it's got a lot more Office 365 targeted actions already built into the catalog. But the list of actions is vast. You can grab anything in here, but they're all prefabbed for a specific thing, right? So if I go to, and I'm going to look at SharePoint stuff, let's go back to this and pick the SharePoint ones. It's when an item is created as a trigger, or I want to create an item, delete an item, edit an item's metadata. So when you're reaching into your cloud services or doing things on, say, I want to call a runbook, it's a little bit limited on on the trigger, right? It's meant to be purpose built and really fast, which is great. But maybe if you need to expand on that a little bit to do just a custom tweak, that's where an Azure function or a runbook can add the extra tweak of one more line of script, right, to make it purple or whatever extra thing that you want to tweak. In this example here for the runbook, we're looking at parameterized add user function. Similar deal. I'm going to give it an identity. This is a credential to use. So go grab my credential, a managed identity. You heard me mention the user assigned managed identity. Go grab that account. That's the one I'm going to authenticate with. It has the biggest benefit or biggest security benefit of the user assigned managed identities. Well, any managed identity in Azure is there is no credential password. It's constantly rotating security. Super secure. It's just a matter of what grants you give it. So grab your managed identity. That's your most secure, best practice way to do this. Give it a method. I'm going to add a user or remove a user. And I'm looking for the group ID, right? So as this gets called either from a webhook or I go back to my logic app and I say, hey, I want to create a job. Let me close this down. Let's click the button again. And I want to add an action for creating an Azure automation job. Let's create a job. It knows the automation account where I'm coming from. Connection name was Whirligig, I think. Whirligig. I want you to be Logic Apps Manager Identity. Oh, I didn't enable it on the Logic app. All right, well, parameterization, it gives you similar to these, right? So like you get a little drop down when you create the job, you get a drop down, you pick which runbook, which automation account it would be in, which would be my Whirligig. That's where this runbook lives, is the Whirligig automation that we looked at. And inside of there, you pick which runbook you want, and then you just feed it the parameters with little drop downs. And it's string fields, or if you have object types like Booleans as a parameter, it can take other more complex objects, arrays. If you had a string array or a JSON payload, you can feed all that through in the parameter and then process it in your runbook script here. All right, so I think I am right up against time or past time. So if I'm going to ask, let's see if I can answer any questions here. It says, can we use runbooks in conjunction with Azure DevOps or other CI/CD tools? Yes, you can. The trigger calls, if you can do an HTTP call, obviously you can run this through either a webhook to pass parameters or hit a logic app. So you can come after the logic app and then again thread that connection through with the create a job for a runbook. You can combine those together. And the pipeline for your CI/CD pipeline on DevOps, you would thread that through the HTTP call. There are connectors for Azure Functions as well. And if you wanted to call without the webhooks, you can. There is a CI/CD for runbook automation as well. You can call either the Azure Automation account, things from the Whirligig here, right? If it's runbooks or Python scripts or whatever, you can trigger those in here without a webhook. Still, there is a connector from the CI/CD in Azure DevOps. And then the Azure Functions, the logic apps, I think you still have to go through. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure on a logic app to call the logic app, you still have to go through an HTTP call to trigger it and feed it, either a get or a post with parameters. So if you on a logic app, if you're doing a post, it's different. Your post is going to take the parameters like this structure. You're going to feed it the proper object type, and it'll take the parameters from that. On a get, you just feed it in the call, and then it reads those out of, you see it here. So when we do just open that link and fire it off, it gives me all those parameters. It reads those parameters right from the get call. So, 6 of one, half dozen of the other there. Depends on what your authentication is too, and if you're passing secured strings or not, or GUIDs, if that's a concern of yours, pay attention to that. Next question. Let's see, looks like, are there any recent updates or improvements to Azure Automation and runbooks that one should know of? I'd say performance improvements, yes, and from logic apps specifically, the connector base is growing. I don't know what the time is from its GA general availability on Power Platform from Power Automate to then translate back into Logic Apps. But that catalog of actions and things on Logic Apps is constantly growing, as is the connector base, right? So if you need a new connector or set up a connector to Salesforce or SAP or whatever, that connector base is growing as well. And that's almost 100% synonymous with the Power Automate flows. From Azure Automation, it's definitely getting a lot of love in the security, specifically around managed identities. There's some big improvements in a lot of the Azure, the PowerShell commandlets. So when you look at here, let me go back to the modules. When I go to look at the module library, I'm going to grab, where are you? Oh, no, sorry, in the automation. I'm going to grab the modules list. And as you're adding a module, you can upload your own modules. So if you have another module that you wrote, you can grab your own. You can get them from online, or you can go to the gallery. So the gallery is pretty vast too. And almost all of the modules that are in here are all getting updated methods or commandlets. I want to say almost all of those, especially anything that's coming from Microsoft Direct. But the PnP team, if you're familiar with things on PnP, it's starting to reach into Azure as well through Graph API. The reach of Graph is spanning across Azure Service Cloud as well, and the PnP commandlets wrap up a lot of that stuff. So specifically in Runbooks for Azure Automation, there are big improvements coming with a lot of the Microsoft commandlets to run under managed identities, so that you're getting, it's really application to application or service to service kind of communication and security without ever having to pass a username or an expired certificate on accident. It automatically manages that for all those managed identities. That's a huge win, and it's really, really secure. So the reach beyond, outside your cloud is there as well. You're just feeding it the GUID of whatever that managed identity is. Go fetch me that managed identity by GUID. Nobody knows what its name is. Nobody cares. They can't grab it. And it's only allowed to do the things that you told it that it can do. I think that hopefully that answered all the questions. Let me also say here in the automation, one of the other things that is getting, I think, some love still is the jobs. The different job types and schedules that you can add to are integrating now to other cloud services like Synapse is a big one. Data Factory, Azure Data Factory, and Synapse are huge. You can do triggers to call to webhook with Event Grid. So you set up your Event Grid to integrate through. So maybe I subscribe to an event from my web app, and I'm doing event triggers. Whenever somebody clicks this link or whenever they navigate to a specific page, my Google Analytics engine can call off a webhook to drop a message on a message bus event hub, where I can throw that on the Event Grid, and the Event Grid can then process back down through all the way through. You can go full cycle to say, hey, Data Factory, grab this event, or Synapse, grab this event. And then the event can also trigger in here for webhooks that you can subscribe up through the Event Grid too. So, you're talking about millions of transactions capability now. I would definitely look at your licensing and how you provision it. Standard is the better way to go if you hit that kind of volume. And consumption is a better way to go if you're looking at, onesie twosies, or like I'm doing here, where one person just clicks a link and it fires off a Logic app. So, but big performance increases there, and compute cycles too. The reach of Azure Automation and functions can get up into the bigger provisioned hardware infrastructure as a service, right? It's the cloud provisioning, so you can get into some pretty big VMs and handle some really decent load coming through. Okay, I think that was all the questions. Let me see. Check all the questions over here. Yeah, I think that was all the questions. Excellent.
All right, Richard, that was great. I want you to catch some breath because You've been speaking non-stop from past 45 minutes.
Sorry, ran a little over there.
No, no, it's absolutely great. I could see. I mean, you covered so much. You talked about automation resource. You talked about logic apps. You talked about SharePoint lists, PowerShell runbooks, and at least half a dozen more topics you covered just in about 45 minutes. And there's a very interesting comment coming in from Ramesh. He ended up saying, "Why call it a live show? How about a movie on Azure Automation?" So much to take from the stream. Thank you, Richard. Thanks, Ramesh, for joining in. Omega says thanks, Richard. Great session. Timber also loves it. So thank you everyone for joining in. So Richard, where else people can find you? Because this was a great session, right? Do you maintain a blog on the internet or a YouTube
Yeah,
channel? What is it?
yeah. So on perpetualreality.com, we do have a blog that's set up there. We are in the process of moving that to the Microsoft blogs. So a lot of the things that we're now writing are going to be pushed over to the Microsoft blog space and docs.microsoft.com. And we're I think formalizing a lot of the things that we're building, package kind of soup to nuts packages for our clientele. We're starting to push those off to docs.microsoft.com and grab, I think, a little bit broader scope. So we're putting our use cases from down in the trenches right into trying to feed it right into docs.microsoft.com. Me personally, I'm out bouncing around. I'll be at conferences kind of throughout the rest of the year.
Wow.
If you're going to be down in Vegas, I know the M365 conferences is down in Vegas coming up here in a month or two. And the partner conference is down there as well. The channel partner and partner conference is the same week. So I'm going to bounce probably back and forth between those two. Aside from that, let's see, plug for
Yeah, come to India. You should come to India.
oh my gosh, I would love to. That would be amazing. If there's
Oh
like an
my
event that I
goodness.
could get out there, I would totally do it. It's during school year here, so I have a hard time getting out with the school
Hmm.
because school schedule for the kids. But yeah, that would be amazing. And then I think as an event, a couple of events I put in from Mexico, one I put
Wow.
in for Canada, and then I did put in for Nordic Summit. That one's
Nordic
just opened
Summit.
up. Yeah, the Nordic Summit just opened up call for speakers.
Hmm.
They're going to be in Denmark. I
Wow.
don't know. I don't know if I can afford that. We'll see. I have to talk. I have to talk the family into not eating so many snacks, I think.
Well, stop making us jealous. You're traveling to little too many conferences.
Yeah, other big ones. Educon. The Educons are great. It's good
Hmm.
faculty here in the U.S. and they put on a great show. So I put in for the Educons. There's Seattle, Chicago, I believe it was Dallas, and DC is right around the corner. Actually, DC is coming up in March. No,
Wow.
sorry, June. DC is in June.
Hmm.
So yeah, lots of those conferences around. So
Yeah.
yeah, all over the place.
That's yeah, that's good. That's good to go back in person and do these events, right? When I go to in-person events, I don't spend a lot of time watching the sessions. I'm usually hanging around in the gallery and talking to folks or in the booth. Hey, what's up?
Yeah, honestly, that's part of the. I feel like that's the best part of the back to in persons.
Yeah,
It's that social connection, and
exactly.
we lose that virtually.
Yeah, we
It's great that we
lose.
get to talk and we can talk freely, but
Hmm.
body language is real,
Exactly.
and a handshake or a fist bump or elbow touches on your
Yeah, now these
totally
days.
comfort level. It's great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those chit chats for the lunch, right? And yeah, we just love that. So, Richard, that was an absolutely great session, Richard. I won't take much of time. I know I only booked your calendar for about 30, 40 minutes. You're already 51 minutes. One final question I would like to ask you before we wrap up the show is what do you do apart from these absolutely amazing demos and some great tech work?
Me and my team, we're down in the weeds a lot. I've got a big client that I'm working with. I'm doing some staff log. In fact, I think I saw something
Hmm.
that's sneaking around in here in the attendee list. But
Hmm.
um, me and my team, we've got several clients that we bounce around in, and we kind of live down in the weeds, in the trenches, bleeding with the new tech all the time. So
Hmm. That's
building,
cool.
building use cases, and then we pull a lot of our training material, the things that we take to conference to show, are a lot of use case driven, from kind of real world experiences, and client use case that we build out in prototype environments, clean rooms. And then
Hmm.
aside from that, hobby stuff. I own a couple of Jeeps. We get out Jeeping in the mountains.
Wow, you're the first one to say that.
Living here in Colorado, it's hard not to. I don't get up nearly as often as I used to,
Hmm.
but me and the family love to go out in the woods and go Jeeping and hit those 14ers and get some great views. We like to
Oh.
camp in the summer. We're coming up to summer, I guess, in a month or two. So we just hit our fall spring. It was
Hmm.
like it was like 70 degrees, and then it dumped snow on us. So all in the same day.
Oh.
It was great. Only in Colorado.
Oh.
Yeah, it's I think, other hobby stuff is, just hanging out with kids,
Yeah.
getting them learned up on life, man. It's
Yeah.
kids is an adventure all of its own.
Oh, well, tell me, I'm not even married.
It's
And
fine. Take your time.
yeah,
Never rush.
long time. That adventure shall come too. We will see to that when it comes. Richard, Richard, is absolutely great hosting you back after almost 2 years. We'd love to have you back whenever you're available. And until then, enjoy your virtual conferences, and we will hope to see you very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks,
Ta-da.
thanks all.
Bye bye.
Take care.